Toastmasters. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the biblical tale of Cain and Abel. But let me just recap what the story is all about. Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam, the first man, and they were very different people. The younger son, Abel, was a God-fearing, very pious and obedient son. He is your typical model student, the A student sitting in the first bench taking notes kind of guy. He was very deferential to elders. He was God-fearing, and he went about his life, didn't trouble anyone. Now, Cain was the exact opposite. He was a troublemaker. He was the kind of guy who would exude confidence in front of other people, and he would go, well, you know, this doesn't look right. So he was always argumentative. He had a critical mindset. And the story goes that once God asked both of them to make an offering. Now, Abel, being a shepherd, but really having more the mindset of a sheep, just did exactly what God asked him to do. He went to his livestock, he took the finest sheep, and he gave it away as sacrifice. Cain, on the other hand, was a thinking man. He thought, well, God doesn't really need a sacrifice. I mean, it's just symbolic, right? And why waste my best gift on him? I could just gift him anything, you know. Okay, it's just a signal. He just wants to know that I'm still listening to him. So he went and took a bale of grass, and he sacrificed that. God wasn't pleased. So God accepted Abel's prayer, but not Cain's. And the story goes on from there that Cain got jealous of Abel and he went and murdered Abel. But I think you all agree with me that the moral that the story is trying to impart is not of morality, because morality comes later. It's only later that Abel turns into murderer. It is about respect for authority. It is about saying Abel did what the big boss told him to do, whereas Cain was kind of thinking whether this was the right thing to do. In fact, I would argue that today, Cain would be held up as a hero because he didn't want to kill animals, so all this PETA animal activists would be right behind him. And also, he was being rational. He thought, why waste my finest crop on someone who doesn't need it when there are people to be fed? However, every culture around the world has some tale or another to establish obedience as a virtue. Every culture tells you that you must be deferential to elders, you must listen to what your teachers say, what your parents say, and you should not be a rebel. Conformity is given great importance in society. However, think about the people you admire. Think about Steve Jobs. Think about Elon Musk. No one ever says, oh, Steve Jobs was an obedient student. No, that's not what you hear. He was a rebel. He went against the grain. He challenged status quo. He changed the society. He changed, that's the operative word here. So obedience, it seems, is a very useful virtue, but it's not something we really admire. So there's a hypocrisy here. Why is that? Before we go into thinking what is more useful, obedience or rebellion, let's think about what is easier for your teacher to handle or your parents to handle. A child who asks too many questions is obviously more work. A student who asks too many questions is not going to be able to, your teacher cannot cater to 40 different minds. That's why they try to make it homogeneous. They try to put you into one set of box, make you think alike. So obedience definitely has a convenience factor. It is scalable. You can produce a factory of robots who think alike, who act alike, who do the same thing. From individual point of view, is obedience better, or is it more, is leadership a better virtue? Rebelling, therefore becoming a leader. From an individual standpoint, it purely depends on whether you're an incumbent person or whether the existing system is against you. If you're a beneficiary of the existing system, sure, of course it makes sense to follow. But then let's recall the words of George Bernard Shaw. He said, the reasonable man adapts himself to the environment, but the unreasonable man tries to change the environment to suit him, and therefore all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Progress comes about because someone disenfranchised with the current system wants to express himself. He exudes that confidence in his own vision, and he wants to change the system. So clearly progress is brought about by people who think outside the box, who do not conform, whereas society, you maintain progress with the use of, by having all these obedient people, all your followers. However, it seems to me that the progress brought about by these rebels has brought us to a stage where its creativity and disobedience is being rewarded in the society finally. And why is that? Even your masters previously, the bosses, they didn't want you to think individually. They wanted you to conform. They wanted you to do what they told you to do. But not so anymore. That is because the nature of work has changed so much. There's so much automation that there's no longer a need for manual labor or human beings to perform the mundane tasks. The problems that need to be solved in society today are all creative problems, which is why you see suddenly people talk about rebels and talk about the creativity and individuality, whereas even 20 years ago, it was not viewed as a favorable virtue. However, we are yet to change the narrative that we tell our children. We still feed them mythology from the old days. We tell them, you have to obey what I say. Whereas, as a parent, maybe my grandfather and my father's world were probably very similar, because in post-independent India, there was a lot of stagnation for 20 years. So, and prior to that, in the old ages, sure, for centuries together, the world would remain the same. So it made a lot of sense to obey what the elders said. But really now, the job that I hold today might not exist around when my kid comes into the world. Things are changing at a rapid pace. And so we have to emphasize critical thinking. We have to teach kids to question and not blindly obey. And we need to respin our old mythologies. One classic example of this retelling that I like a lot is the story of Icarus. Icarus, according to Greek mythology, disobeyed his father, and he flew too high with his wax wings, and he burnt, and he fell into the Icarian Sea. Now, this story was retold by Oscar Wilde, where instead of Icarus being this foolhardy person, he makes him into a hero. And I'd like to conclude with those verses. Never regret thy fall, O Icarus of the fearless flight, for the greatest tragedy of them all is never to feel the burning light. Thank you.